While Trump has an inconceivable 40.3% approval as of this recording, he could still win the 2020 election. His possible victory does not hinge on any pandemic miracle or any other such radical change. He can win even if things keep on their current trajectory. So the obvious question is, how can he win? The first thing to consider, obviously enough, is his 2016 victory over Hillary Clinton. While Joe Biden is leading Trump, the same was true of Hillary Clinton. The polls were actually pretty accurate. Clinton did beat Trump by about 3 million votes in 2016, but she still lost to Trump because of the way the Electoral College works. And so when people say things like, the polls were wrong, we can't trust polling, we can't trust generalizations, well, this is really not the topic of this, but as an aside, because I teach critical thinking, first, obviously, they didn't say that Clinton had a 100% chance of winning, so her loss was always a possibility. Secondly, the surveys and polls did get it right. She did get way more votes than Trump. It just, the way the Electoral College worked, she lost within the predictions that she could lose. But anyways, getting back on track, Trump could do the same thing in 2020. He could get crushed by Biden in the popular vote, yet still win the election. If Trump had to win the majority of the votes, he would certainly lose. But he doesn't need to do that. And this is absolutely critical to a Trump 2020 win, as it was absolutely critical to his 2016 win. So to win the game of politics, as it is played by the rules, he doesn't need a majority. He just needs to win enough electoral votes to take the election. Or, as we'll see in a bit, he just has to kind of get into the courts, which can also result in a Trump victory. Now, one factor helping Trump is that he has a shockingly solid base. Some of his base seem to be analogous to sports fans. They're loyal to him in the way people are fans of sports teams. Professional sports teams obviously stand for nothing significant in terms of values, principles, or policies. For example, I'm from New England, so I'll speak of the Red Sox. One is not a Red Sox fan because the Red Sox stand for constitutional democracy or kindness to animals or moral goodness. You're a fan of, these teams because of where you were born, where you went to school, which team your family rooted for, etc. So take, for example, the Boston Red Sox. Generally, I favor them, but I know full well it's not because I look at the Red Sox and say, yes, they stand for policies I believe in. They are paragons of moral virtue, crusading in an unjust world, bringing about, truth and goodness. No, it just happens that when I grew up, my family watched the Red Sox. I'm from New England, so I have sort of a vague positive feeling towards the Red Sox. Other people, of course, rather more fanatical. Now, people often stick to their fandom, even when their team is losing, even when they lose, relentlessly. People stick to it when players are traded around, when management changes. In fact, as a thought experiment, imagine what would happen if you took an entire team, say the Red Sox, took all the members of the teams, or swapped them in for the Yankees, and swapped the Yankees into the former Yankees, the Red Sox team, swapped the management, etc. What would the fans do? Now, some people, of course, would be like, no way. But other people would be like, well, Red Sox. So the commitment to the team is, not really based on, particular values, etc., etc., because people are fans of the team, which is a fairly abstract thing. And, one could do an entire, series of books on, sports fandom, the identity of teams, etc. But, as long as you get a kind of a gist about how sports fandom works, we can kind of see how support for Trump works in this regard. Naturally, fans of sports teams want to beat the other teams and often have intense rivalries based on nothing of real significance. For example, again, I'm from New England, so I have this vague positive feeling towards the Red Sox, and of course I have a vague negative feeling towards the Yankees. But I don't, actually believe that the Yankees stand for terrible things, that they are paragons of vice crusading for evil and to create an unjust world. They're just overpaid athletes who make a lot of money and, are way better at a sport of baseball than I could ever dream of being. But as far as, there being anything significant there in terms of commitment, etc., well, no, they're just people playing a game. Now, this also seems to hold true for some Trump supporters. They're fans of Trump, they wear his hat, buy his merch, chant his chants, and want him to beat the opposing team. They'll stick with Trump like sports fans stick to a losing team. It is their team. And so these Trump fans will support Trump, like the same way that fans of the Red Sox or the Cubs or the Mets or the Cleveland Browns support their teams, and just out of fandom, not because of any, deep and abiding, moral foundation to their commitment. Now, Trump also seems to have a cult following as well, although this analysis is controversial, despite the fact that it seems accurate. Trump himself has noted that he could commit murder in public and not lose voters. While this is yet to be tested, he does seem to be immune to the consequences of scandals and misdeeds, something that will definitely play a role if he is reelected in 2020. And so the idea that there'll be a scandal appearing that could take Trump down, kind of like, when Comey stepped on the scales in favor of Trump by releasing the stuff about Hillary's emails at a critical time. No matter what happens to Trump, no matter what comes out, suppose it comes out that there's videotape of him with 250 porn stars, and there's heaps of checks that he paid off to them, checks supporting all of this, if there's recordings of him colluding with Russia. In large part, I think this would have zero effect. Every negative claim about Trump could be substantiated, proved with evidence, and I don't think it would have any effect at all. And so he does enjoy this kind of immunity. So he can count on a solid base no matter what he does. I find it difficult to imagine a thing Trump could do that would, cause his base to abandon him. So this gives him a shot at being reelected in 2020. However, there's an obvious problem. His dedicated base, even including just people who are fans and not, what some would call cultists, is a clear numerical minority. And even if you can always count on them, they just wouldn't be enough. So while, to be rather negative, while Trump does seem to enjoy the backing of people who are ignorant of what he really is, which must be willful ignorance at this point, people who are clearly evil, and people who are opportunists, he does face numerous obstacles in expanding from his base. While his appeals to racism, white nationalism, xenophobia, sexism do garner him some support. He is now, coming down, in favor of Confederate monuments, Confederate generals, and basically, supporting essentially, white supremacy. Just, using, of course, coded language like heritage, etc. But anybody who understands how language works knows exactly what he means. But he's probably at this point milked those cows dry. He's not going to be able to squeeze out new supporters by, waving the Confederate flag or defending the statue of Robert E. Lee. And Lee, by the way, in a very prophetic, assertion, he was against monuments because he believed in this case that they would form, points of dissension and so forth in the future. So he turned out to be right about that. So his best option at this point, since he really can't expand his base, is to reduce the votes for Joe Biden. Now, Trump is, of course, well aware of this. Now, Trump, who is famous for shouting what other Republicans whisper behind closed doors, asserted, to quote him, "The things they had in there were crazy. They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again." While Trump is actually probably wrong about this general claim, I do think that Republicans can win in fair elections with large turnout. There are people who are Republican voters, and there are Republican candidates worth voting for. But he's probably quite right in his own case. If most people vote in 2020, the presidential election, then he would most likely lose. As such, Trump is following a well-established strategic plan. The big difference here is that he's actually announcing his moves publicly, as opposed to keeping them, quiet or secret. Now, one factor that predates Trump is the disenfranchisement of Americans who live outside of states. For example, American citizens who are residents of Puerto Rico, and yes, they're American citizens too, they don't get to vote in the presidential election. Why? Well, Puerto Rico has no votes in the Electoral College. It's not a state. Now, given Trump's treatment of Puerto Rico, he would probably not fare well if they were able to vote. While they are citizens, they do not matter when it comes to the presidential election, something that currently seems to favor Trump. Now, again, obviously I'm not blaming Trump for the disenfranchisement of people outside of states, but this is something that will help him. And he seems to believe that fewer people voting, better for Trump. Now, of course, the whole disenfranchisement of people outside of states, electoral college system, a whole other debate. And my position has been, since I believe that legitimacy and democracy rests on majority vote, that all citizens should have their votes, be able to vote, and have those votes count. But that's a whole other can of worms. Now, a second factor that predates Trump is the disenfranchising of felons. While people do attempt a modern defense of this, usually by asking, do you want rapists and murderers to vote? This strategy of disenfranchising felons was a conscious strategy to disenfranchise black voters. While there is some moral appeal in denying rapists and murderers their right to vote, it's worth considering that even minor crimes are often classified as felonies. For example, if an 18-year-old shoplifts an Xbox in Florida, then that would be a felony, because stealing $300 or more is, as of this writing, a felony. So, while you might say, yeah, those rapists and murderers shouldn't vote, what about a kid who's 18, on a dare, shoplifts an Xbox? He's a felon, and in most states he can, never vote ever again. Or he might have to go and, appeal to get his rights back. Should a shoplifting offense deny someone the right to vote. Now, there's also the fact that minorities are policed more aggressively and more likely to be convicted. While it is true that whites do get caught up in this impact is disproportionately on minorities. And Republicans, not all of them, some, tend to believe that minorities will vote for Democrats. Now, while my adopted state of Florida is now allowing some felons to vote, the Republican-controlled legislature is doing its best to sabotage this. While a full analysis of the impact of felony disenfranchisement's impact on elections is obviously beyond the scope of this particular, short video, when you consider that, there are about 19 million Americans with felony records, and most states restrict their voting rights, this can have a significant impact on elections. Now, Republicans, not all, but most, seem to think that this benefits them. And they're probably right. And so this disenfranchisement probably does help Trump. Now, it is, of course, important to note that Republicans do also get disenfranchised because the Republicans who, commit felonies or people who go Republican, but it does probably end up hurting Democrats a bit more. But disenfranchising people for this is, I've argued against this before, is fundamentally wrong. And I have arguments for this. I'm not just going to say it's wrong, leave it at that. I'm going to say it's wrong and point to various essays I've written over the years, making the moral argument as to why this is wrong. A third factor that predates Trump is voter suppression. The Voters' Rights Act used to provide some protection for voters, but it was recently gutted out, and states immediately leaped to passing voter ID laws and other such things that seem clearly aimed at suppressing voters. The general idea behind these tactics is to make it harder for certain classes of people to vote by requiring IDs, by limiting polling hours, by reducing the number of polling sites, and so on. While this does hurt voters of both parties, the belief seems to be that this hurts minorities more, and hence Democrats more. Now, the usual argument, because people, except for, Trump, won't come out and say, yeah, we don't want people to vote. The usual argument is that they're aimed at preventing voter fraud. And of course, what people always say when, Trump claims voter fraud, Republicans claim voter fraud, reputable news outlets always follow it up with claimed without evidence. Because voter fraud doesn't occur at like a zero level, but it occurs at such a minuscule level that it clearly does not warrant these laws. Rather ironically, real cases of election fraud have been perpetrated by Republicans. They're the same holes for voter fraud. Republican Steve Watkins famously has made the news because he's been accused, but not convicted, of voting illegally. Now, if these efforts of voter suppression, election fraud, etc. prove effective, they can definitely help contribute to a Trump victory by reducing the number of Democrats voting and also, of course, committing election fraud. And this would help not increase the number of votes for Trump, but decrease the number of votes for Biden. A fourth factor, which seems kind of new with Trump, is an attack on vote by mail. As with other allegations of fraud, there is no meaningful evidence for this. Ironically, Florida is also his adopted state, so we share an adopted state. Trump votes by mail, as do I. And Florida, even though, of course, Florida, our vote by mail is pretty good. We don't have a lot of, problems with it. So Trump's real worry, in terms of voter fraud, we do have some problems. Now, Trump's real worry about voting by mail seems to be that it would allow for a large turnout, which he believes will hurt him, as he's publicly stated. As such, he is pushing, without evidence, a tale of fraud that is starting to infect the internet. And you go on Facebook, if you have friends who are Trump supporters, they'll post stuff about, crazy things about the post office, about how vote by mail somehow is, going to destroy America. Even despite the fact that we've had vote for mail for literally a couple centuries now. And it works, generally pretty good. The main problems we have with it is not fraud, but people's votes not being counted, that they get discarded unfairly. So the problem here is not voter fraud, but voters not being counted. Now, Trump is stepping up the long-standing Republican war on the United States Post Office, and he seems to be quite willing, as always, to do significant damage to a service that is actually kind of important to many members of his base. For rural Americans, post offices are, really important. Why? Well, he hopes of increasing his chances of winning. Now, Trump has also fairly consistently pushed his followers to reject masks and social distancing, although he has started wearing a mask on some occasions. And I've been, curiously looking kind of at Facebook to see what some of my friends are very anti-mask. And they're talking about how it's tyranny and injustice and so forth. And I've been rather curious to see if their view will change. That what people who support Trump will do now that Trump is wearing a mask. Will they say, just kind of quietly delete all their past posts and just start wearing a mask or what? But anyways, back to the main point. Now, this whole thing about, rejecting social distancing, etc., maybe this is tied up in his post office plan. If vote by mail is discredited and attacked or, reduced or weakened, and Trump's followers are more willing than others to vote in person, because they don't think COVID is that serious, this would definitely help Trump. That is, he seems to be willing to put millions at risk for the hope of an advantage in the election, which is unsurprising. That is literally Trump's, mode of operation. A final factor is that the Republicans control many of the mechanisms of elections and election resolution. Republicans have control of many state legislatures and courts, so contested aspects of the election are likely to end up being resolved by those who favor Trump. For example, if the election ends up in the Supreme Court, it's likely to go 5-4 in Trump's favor. Trump is also refusing to say that he will accept the results of the election if he loses, which is a first for an American president, and shows just how much democracy matters to him. That is, not at all. Now, it might be objected that I'm favoring democracy for sinister reasons. I want Trump to lose, and I know that in a free, fair, and democratic election, he would get utterly crushed. My response is that I consistently favor democracy, even when my party, and I'm kind of vaguely a Democrat, mostly because we really only have two choices in America, which is a whole other, big problem. You can be a Democrat or Republican, or you can be like, again, there are other smaller parties, but they effectively, sadly, amount to nothing. In my adopted state of Florida, the only way you get to vote in primaries is if you have a party. So if you want to participate in the full thing, you gotta pick a party. And I picked the Democrats because, in part because my family's been Democrats, and also they seem less horrible than the Republican Party of today. But again, you got to pick a party in most states. So even when my party loses, I have a written record going way back, my blogs, posts, books, etc., that support this view of democracy. I don't like to lose, but if it's a free, fair election and more people want the Republican than the Democrat, then that's fine. And there are cases where I actually do like the Republican more than the Democrat. I would vote for a good Republican that I know, something I've done, over a Democrat that I know is, terrible. So anyways, and also as a, final kind of response to this, even if my motivation is sinister, it doesn't have any impact on the, the quality of this reasoning. Because, if we think democracy is good, even if my motivation is sinister, that doesn't affect the reasoning at hand. That would be a mere ad hominem. So why does this matter? Well, if you believe in democracy, that the legitimacy of the government rests on the decision of the majority, then these tactics should morally offend and disgust you. If all that matters is that your side wins, then the tactics do not matter. All that matters is victory. If so, you do not believe in democracy. You do not believe in America.